The bone is small enough to sit in a gloved palm. A fragment of jaw. A few worn teeth. Nothing about it looks revolutionary. It came out of archaeological soil the way thousands of animal remains do, silent, ordinary, easy to misfile beneath larger histories. And yet inside bones like these, taken from rabbit remains scattered across Europe and dated from prehistory to the Middle Ages, there was a record no medieval chronicle had preserved. Not a legend. Not a monastery tale. A molecular trace. For a long time, the story of the rabbit seemed settled. Europe's familiar rabbit, the ancestor of all domestic breeds, was widely folded into a neat historical narrative: wild animals in the west of Europe, then human control, then domestication in medieval France, often with an almost too perfect anecdote about monks, fasting rules, and a church loophole that turned a timid wild creature into a domestic companion. It was a story people repeated because it was compact, memorable, and satisfying. The problem was that the evidence underneath it was far less stable than the story itself. Ancient DNA changed that. When researchers began extracting genetic material from archaeological rabbit bones, some thousands of years old, they were not just adding detail to an established account. They were testing whether the account itself had been built on assumptions, misread texts, and a false sense of certainty. The rabbit's past, it turned out, was older, more fractured, and more mobile than the standard version allowed. The first clue was geographical. Long before anyone asked where domestic rabbits came from, zoologists and geneticists had been trying to understand where the European rabbit itself came from in deep time. That question led them not to abbeys or warrens, but to Ice Age refuges. Modern genetic studies of European rabbits revealed two major maternal lineages. One was concentrated in the southwest of the Iberian Peninsula. The other occupied the rest of the rabbit's historic range, including northern Spain, southern France, and, crucially, domestic breeds. That alone complicated the simple story. It suggested that rabbit history was not a single stream but two ancient currents, separated for long periods and shaped by climatic isolation during the Pleistocene. In other words, before rabbits ever entered hutches, recipes, or noble estates, their populations had already been divided by glacial worlds. During the great climatic swings of the Ice Age, rabbit groups survived in separate refugial zones in Iberia. After the glaciers retreated, they expanded again, carrying with them the marks of ancient separation. What looked like one familiar animal had a much deeper internal history. But deep history was only part of the puzzle. The more unsettling question came from time. When scientists examined DNA from ancient rabbit bones across archaeological sites in Europe and North Africa, they found something remarkably stubborn. For millennia, the genetic structure of wild rabbit populations appeared relatively stable. Then, around the late Roman and early medieval period, that stability broke. A new mitochondrial type, one associated today with domestic rabbits, began appearing abruptly in French populations where it had not been seen in earlier remains. That is the kind of pattern historians notice because it behaves like an intrusion. Not a slow local drift. Not a quiet natural expansion alone. An arrival. The missing link was suddenly visible, but not yet explained. If this lineage was absent from older French material, then where had it come from? And how had it spread so quickly? Ancient DNA pointed back toward Spain. That is one of the most important reversals in the rabbit story. The maternal lineage that dominates domestic rabbits was not simply a local French development appearing out of nowhere in medieval enclosures. Its deeper origin appears to lie in Iberian populations. Evidence from archaeological bones suggested that animals carrying this lineage were introduced into France by human agency sometime between late Roman antiquity and the Middle Ages. That does not give us a single dramatic domestication moment. In fact, it does the opposite. It dissolves one. Instead of one clean point of origin, what emerges is a chain of movement and management. Wild rabbits had a restricted original range centered on the Iberian Peninsula and southern France. Humans hunted them very early. They transported them around the western Mediterranean. They enclosed them, harvested them, protected them, and in some periods intensified their management. By the time medieval Europe begins to leave clearer documentary shadows, part of the process was already old. And this is where one of the most repeated rabbit stories starts to come apart under forensic light. The famous tale claims that French monks domesticated rabbits after a papal ruling allowed the consumption of fetal or newborn rabbits during Lent. It is a wonderfully efficient origin myth because it offers motive, place, institution, and transformation in one stroke. But when scholars traced the references behind that claim, they found something far more embarrassing than mysterious. The supposed papal edict was not where later writers said it was. Sources had been confused. Names had been conflated. A much murkier anecdotal tradition had hardened, through repetition, into fact. The myth survived because it was narratively perfect. The evidence did not survive the same scrutiny. That does not mean monasteries played no role in the rabbit's changing relationship with people. Medieval institutions almost certainly contributed to rabbit management, breeding, and spread. But ancient DNA and source criticism together make one thing very clear: the rabbit was not suddenly invented as a domestic animal by a single clerical decision. Its history had already been unfolding across landscapes, economies, and human habits long before that legend took shape. The forensic picture becomes sharper when genetics moves from mitochondrial traces to the wider genome. When researchers compared wild and domestic rabbits at the genomic level, they did not find a dramatic switch, the kind of singular mutation people often imagine when they think of domestication. There was no one master gene for becoming tame. Instead, domestication in rabbits appears to have involved small shifts across many genes, especially genes linked to brain and nervous system development. The changes were subtle, distributed, and cumulative. Domestic rabbits seem to have arisen not because humans created an entirely new creature overnight, but because they altered the frequencies of many existing variants already present in wild populations. That matters because it changes the very meaning of origin. If domestication were caused by one dramatic event, we might hope to pin the rabbit's beginning to a room, a year, a decree, a first pair in captivity. But if domestication was a gradual reshaping of behavior through many small changes, then the origin of the rabbit we know becomes harder to locate. It recedes from ceremony and enters process. And process leaves stranger evidence. A rabbit may be hunted without being domestic. It may be transported without being tamed. It may be enclosed, bred, protected from predators, and managed as a food resource while still hovering in a gray zone between wild and domestic. The Romans kept rabbits in managed enclosures. Medieval elites prized them. Warrens spread. Bones appear where they did not appear before. Genetic signatures travel with people. What ancient DNA reveals is not a clean boundary but a long negotiation. That is why the rabbit story matters beyond rabbits. This is a case study in how historical certainty gets manufactured. A modest animal with a familiar face became trapped inside a story humans preferred: sudden, intentional, legible. Ancient DNA exposed something more difficult and more honest. Animal histories are often mosaics. Climate shapes the first map. Isolation builds hidden lineages. Human appetite moves bodies across regions. Management begins before domestication is complete. And later generations compress centuries of ambiguity into one convenient anecdote. The rabbit, then, is not just a pastoral footnote. It is a witness to the way Europe rearranged nature. Its original world was small, mostly Iberia and part of France. Its later world became enormous, carried by trade, estates, hunting culture, farming, and eventually empire. From those old Western populations came an animal that would be bred into dozens of forms, shipped across continents, and in some places become a devastating invasive force. But beneath all of that expansion sits an older truth preserved in bone. The domestic rabbit's ancestry is tied to a lineage with Iberian roots, later moved and amplified by people, not conjured neatly into existence by a medieval myth. So the next time a rabbit seems like the most self-evident of creatures, soft, familiar, almost childish in its cultural role, it is worth remembering what had to be uncovered to understand it at all. A fragment of jaw. Ancient molecules. A chronology with gaps in it. A lineage that appears where it should not, then leads investigators across France, into Spain, and back beyond written history to Ice Age refuges. That is the final irony. The animal that came to symbolize innocence turns out to have one of the more elusive origin stories in the archive. Not because the evidence was absent, but because for centuries we kept preferring the wrong kind of evidence. And once that preference is removed, the rabbit changes. It is no longer just the creature of medieval legend or domestic familiarity. It becomes a layered biological survivor, shaped by glacial isolation, carried by human hands, altered by gradual selection, and finally identified not by the stories told about it, but by the traces it left behind. If this kind of evidence-led history is what you come here for, you're welcome to stay with the channel. Because sometimes the smallest bone on the table is the one that quietly turns the whole story over.